January 17, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. The air hung thick with the smell of cordite and wet earth. In a makeshift clearing carved from the jungle by artillery fire, a young Japanese soldier lay crumpled against the splintered remains of a palm tree. His uniform, once pristine with the pride of the Imperial Army, was now darkened with mud and blood. A shrapnel wound had torn through his abdomen, and he could feel his life draining into the Philippine soil with each labored breath. Above him, the canopy filtered the afternoon light into fractured beams, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rumble of American tanks advancing through the valley. He closed his eyes and waited for death, not with fear, but with the resigned acceptance that had been drilled into him since his first day of military training. Death in battle was honor. Capture was shame. And medical treatment from the enemy? That was an impossibility his mind couldn't even formulate. The Americans would execute him, surely. Or worse, they would torture him for information before leaving him to die alone in this godforsaken jungle. This is what he had been told. This is what every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army believed with the certainty of gospel. The sound of boots approached. American voices speaking in that strange, fluid language he couldn't understand. He tensed, preparing for the bullet that would end his suffering. Instead, he felt hands, gentle hands, rolling him onto his back. He opened his eyes to see two American soldiers crouching over him, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. One of them was calling for a medic. The other was already cutting away his uniform, exposing the wound. The Japanese soldier tried to speak, to tell them to finish it, to grant him the warrior's death he had been promised. But no words came, only blood, bubbling from his lips as his punctured lungs struggled for air. And then another American arrived, this one wearing a red cross on his helmet. The medic knelt beside him, and the wounded soldier saw something in the American's eyes that shattered every belief he had carried in a battle. Compassion. "Easy there, buddy," the medic said softly, though the Japanese soldier couldn't understand the words. "We've got you." In that moment, as morphine flooded his system and skilled hands began the work of saving his life, the young soldier from Osaka began to weep. Not from pain, but from the devastating realization that everything he had been taught about the enemy was a lie. This scene, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater, represented one of the most profound psychological confrontations of the Second World War. It was a collision not merely of armies, but of ideologies so fundamentally different that the losing side could scarcely comprehend what they were experiencing. Four Japanese soldiers, raised under the code of Bushido and the imperial cult that venerated death over surrender, the American practice of treating enemy wounded with the same care as their own was not just unexpected, it was philosophically incomprehensible. To understand the depth of this cultural shock, one must first understand what Japanese soldiers were told about Americans before they ever met them in combat. From the earliest days of their military training, recruits were indoctrinated with a narrative of American barbarism and cruelty. Instructors told them that Americans tortured prisoners, that they mutilated the dead, that they showed no mercy to the wounded. Propaganda films depicted American soldiers as savage, subhuman creatures who would crush Japanese culture and enslave the Japanese people if given the chance. Soldiers were issued cyanide capsules and told that suicide was preferable to capture. Officers carried out brutal training exercises designed to eliminate any instinct towards self-preservation, replacing it with an absolute commitment to death before dishonor. This wasn't mere rhetoric. The Japanese military system was built on a foundation of shame and honor that Western observers struggled to comprehend. A soldier who surrendered brought disgrace not only upon himself, but upon his entire family. His name would be struck from family registers. His relatives would be shunned. In the most extreme cases, families were told their captured sons were dead, and funeral rites were performed while the soldiers were still alive in POW camps. The pressure to die rather than surrender was not just military protocol. It was a fundamental restructuring of the survival instinct itself. Against this backdrop, the American approach to captured enemy soldiers was nothing short of revolutionary. The United States military, guided by the Geneva Conventions and by a deeply embedded cultural value for human life, treated prisoners of war with a standard of care that shocked not only the Japanese, but many observers around the world. American field medics were trained to treat enemy wounded with the same urgency as American wounded. POW camps, while far from luxurious, provided food, medical care, and living conditions that often exceeded what Japanese soldiers had experienced in their own military. This wasn't sentiment. It was policy, codified in training manuals and enforced by military police and oversight committees. The philosophical roots of this difference ran deep. American democracy, flawed as it was, rested on Enlightenment principles that recognized inherent human dignity. The individual mattered. Life had value beyond its utility to the state. This wasn't just theory. It was embedded in the practical functioning of American military medicine. By 1945, the United States had developed the most sophisticated combat medical system the world had ever seen. Sulfa drugs, penicillin, blood plasma, and rapid evacuation protocols meant that an American soldier wounded in combat had a better chance of survival than a civilian in an American hospital just 20 years earlier. And crucially, this system was extended to enemy wounded, not out of naive idealism, but out of a calculated understanding that humane treatment of prisoners yielded intelligence, demonstrated American values, and ultimately contributed to victory. For the Japanese soldier lying in that Philippine clearing, none of this context existed. He knew only what he experienced. Americans who should have killed him were instead fighting to keep him alive. The medic who worked over him for 30 minutes, plugging the hole in his abdomen and establishing in 4-line with practiced efficiency, was risking his own life in a combat zone to save an enemy. This made no sense within the worldview the soldier had been given. Enemies didn't do this. Warriors didn't do this. And yet, it was happening. As the soldier was loaded onto a stretcher and carried through the jungle to an aid station, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he woke, he expected to find himself in a torture chamber or bound and awaiting execution. Instead, he found himself in a tent illuminated by electric lights, surrounded by other wounded soldiers, both American and Japanese. Doctors and nurses moved between them without apparent distinction, treating wounds and administering medication with the same clinical focus regardless of which uniform the patient had worn hours earlier. In the cot next to him, another Japanese soldier lay with his leg in traction, his femur shattered by machine gun fire. This soldier was older, perhaps 30, with the weathered face of a career military man. He had been conscious when he was captured 3 days earlier, and unlike the younger soldier, he had been fully aware of what was happening to him. He had screamed at the Americans to kill him, had begged for death in broken English. They had ignored his pleas and stabilized his leg instead. Now he stared at the ceiling of the tent with the hollow eyes of a man whose entire reality had collapsed. "They won't let us die," the older soldier whispered when he realized the younger man was awake. "I've tried to refuse food. I've tried to tear out the tubes. They won't let us die." This phrase, "they won't let us die," became a common refrain among Japanese prisoners of war, spoken with a mixture of confusion, shame, and dawning wonder. It represented the fundamental incompatibility between the Japanese military ethos of death before dishonor and the American conviction that preserving life was itself an honorable act. For many Japanese soldiers, the experience of being kept alive against their will was more psychologically traumatic than combat itself. They had been prepared to die. They had made peace with death. But they had not been prepared to be saved by their enemy, to be treated with a decency that invalidated everything they thought they knew about war and about themselves. The statistics tell part of this story. Of the approximately 50,000 Japanese soldiers who surrendered or were captured during the Pacific War, the survival rate in American custody exceeded 95%. This figure is extraordinary when compared to the approximately 40% survival rate of Allied prisoners in Japanese custody. The disparity wasn't merely one of resources, though American material abundance certainly played a role. It was a disparity of values, of fundamental beliefs about what human beings owed to one another, even in the extremity of war. Japanese prisoners were provided with medical care that often exceeded what they had received in their own military. Malnutrition was endemic in the Japanese army by 1944 as supply lines collapsed and soldiers were expected to live off the land, a euphemism for slow starvation in the jungles of the Pacific. When American medics first examined captured Japanese soldiers, they were shocked by the prevalence of beriberi, pellagra, and other diseases of dietary deficiency. Men who had been elite soldiers just months earlier were walking skeletons, their bodies consuming their own muscle to survive. The American response was systematic and comprehensive. High-calorie diets, vitamin supplements, treatment for parasites and tropical diseases that Japanese military medicine had simply ignored. One American medical officer, Captain David Rothberg, kept detailed notes on the psychological responses of Japanese prisoners to medical treatment. Writing in his diary after a particularly long day at an aid station on Okinawa, he recorded, "Today, I watched a Japanese sergeant weep as our nurses changed his bandages. Not from pain. We'd given him enough morphine to knock out a horse. He wept because he couldn't understand why we were being kind to him. He kept saying the same phrase in Japanese over and over. One of our translators told me he was saying, 'I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this.' It breaks your heart." This sense of unworthiness was pervasive among Japanese POWs. They had been taught that surrender was the ultimate shame, that they had forfeited their humanity by failing to die in combat. And yet, the Americans treated them as human beings worthy of care and dignity. The cognitive dissonance was severe. Some prisoners became catatonic, unable to process the contradiction between what they believed and what they experienced. Others became intensely cooperative, volunteering information and assistance, not because they were coerced, but because the humane treatment they received awakened a reciprocal desire to help their captors. Still others fell into deep depression, convinced that the kindness was temporary, that the torture and execution would come eventually, and that the delay only prolonged their shame. But slowly, for many prisoners, something else began to emerge. A fundamental reordering of belief. If the Americans were not the barbarians they had been told to expect, then what else had been a lie? If the enemy showed mercy when Japanese officers had shown none, what did that say about the righteousness of Japan's cause? These were dangerous questions, the kind that undermined not just military morale, but the entire ideological structure of Imperial Japan. And they were questions that couldn't be suppressed once they had been asked. The American military understood the propaganda value of well-treated prisoners. Photographs of healthy Japanese POWs were dropped over Japanese lines, along with leaflets explaining how to surrender safely. Recordings of prisoners urging their comrades to give up were broadcast from loudspeakers on the battlefield. This was psychological warfare, certainly, but it was psychological warfare grounded in truth. The prisoners in those photographs were genuinely healthy. The voices on those recordings were genuinely urging surrender because they had genuinely been treated well. The best propaganda, the Americans understood, was simply showing the truth. One of the most poignant symbols of this ideological clash was food. To American soldiers, food was fuel, often monotonous but always abundant. Complaints about K rations and C rations were endemic in the American military, with soldiers grousing about the sameness of canned hash and processed cheese. But to Japanese prisoners, American military rations were a revelation. The sheer quantity was staggering. More food in a single day than many Japanese soldiers had seen in a week. And it wasn't just quantity, but variety. Canned fruit, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. These were luxuries that most Japanese soldiers had never tasted even in peacetime. Meals became a daily confrontation with American abundance. Prisoners would eat their portions and then stare in disbelief as American guards threw away half-eaten cans of food as if it were nothing. The waste was offensive to men who had been starving, but it was also instructive. It demonstrated an industrial capacity that Japan simply couldn't match. One prisoner, interviewed decades after the war, recalled his first meal in American custody. "They gave us stew with actual meat in it, and bread that was soft and white. I thought perhaps this was a special meal, a last meal before execution. But then the next morning, they gave us breakfast, eggs and bacon and more bread. And I realized this is just how they eat. Every day, this abundance, this casual wastefulness, it was more frightening than their weapons. How do you fight an enemy who throws away more food than your country produces? This realization that American power rested not just on military might, but on an economic system that produced abundance beyond anything the Japanese Empire could imagine, was devastating to imperial ideology. Japan's military leaders had assured the population that Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, would overcome American material superiority. They had framed the war as one of spiritual purity against Western decadence. But when Japanese soldiers saw that American decadence meant more food, better medicine, and more effective weapons, the narrative collapsed. Spirit couldn't stop a bullet. Honor couldn't heal a wound. And no amount of propaganda could explain why the spiritually inferior Americans were winning on every front. The medical treatment of Japanese prisoners wasn't just about physical healing. It was about demonstrating the practical superiority of the American system. Every life saved was a testament to American organizational capacity, industrial strength, and cultural values. The Japanese military had told its soldiers that Americans valued things over people, that capitalist individualism made them weak and fractious. But the reality was precisely the opposite. American individualism, grounded in respect for human life, produced a military machine that valued its soldiers enough to bring them home alive. And it extended that value even to enemy soldiers, because the principle of human dignity wasn't contingent on nationality. By mid-1945, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, American POW camps in the Pacific held thousands of Japanese prisoners. These camps were communities of shattered certainty, where men who had expected to die as heroes found themselves alive as prisoners, grappling with the implications. Some prisoners withdrew into sullen silence. Others embraced their captivity with an eagerness that bordered on desperation, learning English, studying American culture, and trying to understand the system that had defeated them so thoroughly. The American authorities established re-education programs, not through coercion, but through exposure. Prisoners were shown films about American life, given access to books and newspapers, and encouraged to ask questions. Many prisoners were shocked by what they learned. They discovered that America was not a monolithic society of automatons controlled by Jewish financiers, as Japanese propaganda had claimed, but a diverse nation of immigrants who argued constantly and yet somehow functioned effectively. They learned that American soldiers, far from being professional killers, were mostly civilians in uniform who wanted nothing more than to go home. They saw that American democracy, whatever its flaws, produced prosperity and innovation that imperial authoritarianism could not match. One of the most powerful tools in this informal re-education was simply allowing prisoners to observe American soldiers. The casual egalitarianism of the American military, where enlisted men openly complained about officers and officers tolerated it, was shocking to Japanese prisoners accustomed to a rigid hierarchy where a private might be beaten to death for a minor infraction. The sight of American soldiers joking with their officers, questioning orders, and still functioning as an effective fighting force challenged everything Japanese military culture stood for. It suggested that discipline didn't require brutality, that respect could coexist with familiarity, and that a military didn't have to crush individuality to achieve cohesion. As the months passed and Japan's defeat became undeniable, some prisoners began to articulate a new understanding. They had not been defeated by American superiority, they reasoned, but by the flawed system that had sent them to war in the first place. The American medics who had refused to let them die had shown them something their own officers never had, that their lives had value beyond their utility as weapons. This realization was simultaneously liberating and devastating. It meant that the deaths of their comrades had been meaningless, that the sacrifices of the Japanese people had been squandered by leaders who valued ideology over human life. But it also meant that survival was not shameful, that there was a world beyond the narrow code of Bushido, and that they might someday rebuild their lives with dignity. The weeping of Japanese prisoners when American medics saved their lives was not just an emotional response to physical relief. It was grief for the lies they had believed, anger at the leaders who had betrayed them, and tentative hope that perhaps the world was not as cruel as they had been taught. Those tears represented the collapse of one worldview and the painful birth of another. They were tears of men who had discovered that their enemy was more humane than their own commanders, that the nation they had been told to hate practiced mercy, while the empire they had been told to die for practiced brutality. The symbolic power of this moment extended far beyond the individual soldiers who experienced it. When the war ended and prisoners returned to Japan, many carried with them a transformed understanding of the world. They had seen American abundance firsthand. They had experienced American mercy, and they had recognized that Japan's defeat was not just military, but ideological. The American occupation of Japan, whatever its complications and compromises, was eased by the fact that thousands of returned POWs could testify that the Americans were not monsters, that they had been treated fairly, and that perhaps cooperation was preferable to continued resistance. This is not to romanticize the American war effort, which included its own atrocities and moral failures. The firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the internment of Japanese Americans. These were profound moral stains that no amount of humane treatment of prisoners could erase. But in the specific context of POW treatment, the contrast between American and Japanese practices was stark and consequential. The decision to treat enemy wounded as human beings worthy of medical care was not just ethically correct, it was strategically brilliant. It undermined enemy morale, produced valuable intelligence, and demonstrated the superiority of the American system more effectively than any propaganda could. The Japanese soldier who wept in that Philippine jungle in January 1945 survived his wounds. He was evacuated to a hospital in Manila, then to a POW camp in Guam, and finally repatriated to Japan in 1946. He returned to Osaka to find his city in ruins, his family scattered, and his nation occupied by the enemy that had saved his life. He never spoke publicly about his experience, but he told his children years later about the American medic who had knelt beside him in the jungle and refused to let him die. He told them about the tears that had come when he realized he was being saved, not killed. And he told them that this moment had taught him something essential, that the measure of a civilization was not its military power or its imperial grandeur, but how it treated the vulnerable, even when those vulnerable were enemies. This lesson, learned in the crucible of war by thousands of Japanese prisoners, became part of the foundation for post-war Japan. The men who returned from American captivity were among the most enthusiastic supporters of the new democratic constitution, because they had seen democracy in action and recognized its practical superiority. They had witnessed an enemy who valued life over glory, abundance over austerity, and individual dignity over collective shame. And they had understood, in the depths of their humiliation and transformation, that these values were not weakness but strength. The refusal of American medics to let Japanese prisoners die was a small act, repeated countless times across the vast theater of the Pacific War. It was not dramatic in the way of great battles or famous speeches, but it was profound in its implications. It represented the collision of two fundamentally different ideas about what it meant to be human, what it meant to be civilized, and what it meant to wage war. In the end, the nation that valued life defeated the nation that glorified death. The nation that fed its prisoners overcame the nation that starved its own soldiers. And the nation that showed mercy, however imperfectly, prevailed over the nation that had made cruelty a virtue. The tears of those Japanese prisoners were not just personal grief. They were the tears of an ideology dying, of a worldview collapsing, of men discovering that they had been lied to about the most fundamental questions of existence. They were tears of loss and relief, of shame and hope, of ending and beginning. And they were, in their way, a prophecy of the world that would emerge from the ashes of the war, a world in which the victors chose mercy over vengeance, and in doing so, won not just the war but the peace that followed. In the final accounting of the Second World War, the great battles and strategic decisions rightfully dominate the historical narrative. But in the lived experience of individual soldiers, it was often the small moments that mattered most. For thousands of Japanese soldiers, that moment came when an American medic knelt beside them and chose to save their life rather than end it. That choice, multiplied across years and across the expanse of the Pacific, demonstrated a truth more powerful than any weapon. That civilization is measured not by how fiercely it can fight, but by how mercifully it can win.